Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the origins of the Cold War. And you might see the word origin pop up every so often, and that just means the beginning. So we're talking about the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War lasted from the end of World War II until the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in 1991. We talked about how communism was starting to spread around the world during this time. Uh, However, in 1991, communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. And this war was fought through demonstrations of strength and power between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was not a military conflict. So this just means no fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States took place. There was fighting in other countries, but the United States and the Soviet Union never fought, even though this was against each other. And the United States and the Soviet Union represented starkly different fundamental values. And examples include the United States represented democratic political institutions and a free market economic system. So all that means is democratic just means people vote. So in the United States, people vote. And there is a free market economic system, which means the government doesn't really get involved with economics. If we want to buy something, we buy it. The government doesn't tell us what we need to buy. Whereas the Soviet Union was a totalitarian government, which means a government that controls everything. And it was with a communist socialist economic system. So communist economic system just means the government controls everything, but it's also where everybody is equal. And they had a totalitarian government, and that's where the government controls everything. So you don't go to the grocery store and buy food, the government just gives you food. You don't go buy a house, the government gives you a house. You don't choose your job, the government tells you what job you're going to have. So the government controls everything in a totalitarian society. And communist just means everything's equal. You all get paid the same, you have the same house. Just means everybody's equal. The United States implements a policy called containment. And the Truman Doctrine of containment of communism was a guiding principle of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. It encouraged the U.S. not to uproot, which means to defeat communism where it already existed, but to keep it from spreading and to resist communist aggression into other countries. So the United States, we're not going to fight the Soviet Union, even though they're communists, but we're going to make sure communism doesn't spread. So if communism pops up all of a sudden in South Korea, we're going to go fight to make sure communism doesn't go there. So we're going to fight areas that are new. And one thing that happens during this time is the communist takeover in China shortly after World War II increased American fears of communist domination in most of the world. So a lot of countries are starting to become communist, and the United States fears that communists are going to take over the world. However, China and the Soviet Union, they're both communist nations, did not become allies. And allies means friends. They became rivals, which rivals means against each other. And they fought over territory and diplomatic influence. And this was exploited by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. So the Soviet Union and China, even though they are communist, they became rivals, which means against each other. So they didn't like each other. And this is just a quick map of, this is the People's Republic of China. The Soviet Union is actually just right above the People's Republic of China. And there's something called the arms race that happens, and this was a race between the United States and the Soviet Union to have the most nuclear weapons. So we dropped a nuclear weapon, which is an atomic bomb, to end World War II, when we were the first country to build an atomic bomb. However, the Soviet Union was able to build atomic bombs shortly afterwards. So the Soviet Union matched the US in nuclear weaponry in the 1950s. This made the threat of a nuclear war that would destroy both countries realistic and ever present throughout the Cold War. So this was a scary time because if the United States and Soviet Union did ever fight each other, they had enough nuclear weapons where we can destroy each country. So the Soviet Union, they could have destroyed the entire United States with their nuclear weapons, whereas the United States, we also could have destroyed the Soviet Union. But luckily, it never came to that. We never blew each other up. And America, under President Eisenhower, adopted a policy of massive retaliation to deter any nuclear strikes by the Soviets. So we just made sure we had enough weapons that if the Soviet Union ever did anything to us, we could do even more to them. And this just kind of shows you the arm race. In the 1950s, there wasn't that many nuclear weapons. When you see warheads, which it says right here, warheads just means weapons, there wasn't that many. However, the United States, we start building nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union, which is the red, they start building nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union actually has more nuclear weapons than the United States. But when the Cold War ends in 1991, you can see what happens. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, we start getting rid of a bunch of our nuclear weapons. We don't have as many as we used to. And we're going to talk about a military conflict that came up, and it's called the Korean War. And following World War II, Korea was split into North and South in 1948. Both claimed legitimate governments over all of Korea, and this conflict turned to war in 1950. The United States and the United Nations supported South Korea, while the Soviet Union and China supported North Korea. So the United States and the United Nations, which remember the United Nations was built to prevent world wars, supported South Korea. In the Soviet Union and China, which are both communists, supported North Korea, and that's because North Korea is communist. And the United States' involvement in the Korean War in the early 1950s reflected the American policy of containment. And remember, containment means stopping the spread of communism. So here's North Korea, and North Korea, which is communist, South Korea is democratic. North Korea went in and started attacking South Korea, and the United States, did not want communism to spread. That's what containment is. Containment means stopping the spread of communism. So we put in a bunch of troops. We sent a lot of military in to kick the North Koreans out. That way South Korea would stay democratic. And early in the war, it appeared the South would lose due to Northern invasion, but the South battled back, and the war eventually turned into a stalemate. And stalemate, all that means is a tie. And toward the end of the conflict, most of the fighting took place along the 38th parallel that separated North and South Korea. The fighting ended in 1953 when an armistice, which is an agreement to stop fighting. And today, north of the 38th parallel is North Korea, and south of the 38th parallel is South Korea. As a result, the Korean Demilitarized Zone was created to permanently separate the two nations, which still exists today. And today, the U.S. military maintains a presence in South Korea. And nobody won the war, as North Korea remained communist and South Korea remained democratic. And this just shows an example. This is a map of North and South Korea today. There is not one Korea country because it's split in half. And it's split along the 38th parallel, which is just a line that goes across. So above the 38th parallel is North Korea. Below the 38th parallel, South Korea. And the 38th parallel, right in the middle, that's the demilitarized zone. So there's 2 miles where it's separated between North and South Korea. That's it for the Cold War, or at least it for the origins of the Cold War. We're going to talk more about the Cold War the next few days. If you guys have any questions, let me know.